Hello neighbors, it's Brad here at eTrailer, and today we're taking a look and installing the Demco Air Force One supplemental braking system. Now this is going to be a great option if you have air brakes on your coach, and today it's going on a 2016 GMC Terrain. Now when flat towing your Terrain, there's going to be 5 main components required for flat towing, and the first one's going to be a base plate, and that's going to be the attachment point for all of your components, and it's attached to the frame of the vehicle, creating a nice sturdy mounting point. Going along with that, you have safety chains, which are, in case of a disconnect, it's going to hold everything together, and that way the car is not getting disconnected. Now, between your base plate and the hitch on the RV, you are going to have your tow bar, and that is simply that connection point that allows it to pivot as you're going down the road. Now, you're also going to have a supplemental braking system, and that way when you apply the brakes on the RV, it's going to transmit to the towed vehicle, bringing it to a slow or stop, and also you have a breakaway cable with that, and that way, in case of a catastrophic disconnect, it's going to pull that brake, this switch here, applying the brakes on the vehicle, bringing it to a stop. That way it's not rolling down the highway. Now on this vehicle, you do want to take a look at the Roadmaster Fuse Master, because you're supposed to pull a fuse for the ABS module, and that way the steering doesn't get kind of out of whack as you're towing. And we have videos available for that Fuse Master to make sure you get that installed. And something else that I recommend is also getting a charge line, and that's going to simply trickle charge the battery on your towed vehicle and keep that battery nice and charged while going down the road. And that's pretty easy to tie in with your diode wiring, so I recommend doing that while you have that installed. Now, a supplemental braking system is required on most flat-towed vehicles, and on our Terrain, absolutely. It falls in that weight category where you're going to need them. And having a coach with air brakes means that you are going to be limited when it comes to your braking system, but you're in luck because the Air Force One is a great system. It's pretty simple as far as the vehicle side to get installed, and it's pretty tried and true. We've done plenty of installations, and they always work really well. And the way that it works is it's going to tie into the air brakes on your RV. You'll have your own separate tank with supplied air and metered air, which will then feed to a fitting on the back, and through this coiled line that's going to run to the fitting on the front of the vehicle, and that's going to give it that air pressure to the main unit, which will then transfer it to the pedal of the vehicle. So as you apply the brakes, air pressure will go through and go to the cylinder that's mounted on your brake pedal, which will bring it closer to the firewall, slowing down the vehicle. Now you also have a breakaway switch, and in case of a catastrophic disconnect, if everything was to fail, it's going to pull this cable and it's going to apply the brakes on the vehicle, bringing it to a stop. That way it's not rolling down the highway. Now we have it installed here in our engine bay, and it's really hard to see. We have our main unit. I've just mounted up here. It's a pretty small footprint. Now this system does not require tying into diode wiring, so some of your other systems will need to, but it really makes it pretty easy. You just have 2 wires off of this main unit, and then you have some air lines that run into it. You are going to be tying into your brake booster line, but that's not as scary as you might think. You'll have to run a few things through the firewall to give you not only the air line to the cylinder, but also power for your indicator light, which will light up when the brakes are being applied, giving you a physical sign that the brakes are being applied, which is a pretty easy system to get in place as well. So I'm going to walk you through all the steps to make sure you get yours installed. So let's take a look at that. Now, when it comes to installing a braking system on any flat-towed vehicle, I highly suggest having the front fascia off. If you're already installing your base plate, now's a great time to be able to mount up some of the components. And when it comes to the Air Force Ones, this is actually a fairly simple system, at least on the car side. There's quite a bit less wiring involved than something like a stay-and-play Duo. So the main thing is getting all your components laid out, and that's pretty much any braking installation. It can look like it's overwhelming, but you simply have components that need to mount up in certain places, and then there's just connections made between all of them. So my goal is to lay out where all of them go. That way you know where to mount them up on your vehicle, and then I'll show you how to get all those connections made. So starting off on the front, luckily for us, normally there's a power steering cooler that mounts to these tabs. Well, our vehicle didn't have that, so this is where I'm going to mount up our air fitting and also our breakaway switch. Being that we have a coach with air, the air is going to go through our fitting via a coiled up cable that runs to another fitting on the RV. So that way when the brakes are applied, it'll go through the reservoir tank and it'll be regulated down to be able to feed into this system, which has a push connect fitting for a 1/4 inch air line. That 1/4-inch air line will eventually make its way to the main unit, and that's where the air is going to be transferred and eventually make its way to the cylinder that's mounted on the pedal. So this air fitting, just make sure you have it in a nice location up front. Generally by your 6-spool is great. Now if your RV already has a brake sync or a fitting already on it, maybe a previous tank, try to match this to the same side. That way you don't have cables kind of crossing over each other. It makes it a little bit cleaner. So this will live up front and we'll have our airline on it later. Another component that needs to be mounted up on the front is your breakaway switch. So this is in case of a catastrophic disconnect. It's going to pull this cable and apply the brakes on the vehicle. So you can see we have this kind of coiled up section with these carabiners. This will just go to the hitch on the RV. So if our safety cables, our tow bar, everything fails, this is the last line of defense to really apply the brakes. And that way, if it does catastrophically disconnect, it'll apply the brakes on the vehicle. It's not going to be rolling down the highway. Now this is going to be tying into our power as well as our main unit, but this will mount up front here. Now a lot of times people will bolt these up to where they can kind of slide them. They're a little bit cleaner, but the main thing is just have this mounted up front. If you need to, you can bend this tab to kind of custom fit it as well. Now this is our main unit, and the Air Force One is actually a pretty small footprint compared to some of the other braking systems out there, so it makes it really easy to mount this up. Now this generally lives inside of the engine bay. You can kind of get creative. If you really wanted to, you can mount this in the front of the vehicle. You can find a whole lot of spots that this can fit. But the main thing is having it nice and easy to get to not only your two wires that come off of here, but also we have 3 air fittings. So air in, that's going to be the 1/4-inch airline tube that comes from our fitting. So that's going to take the air in from the RV. The air out is going to need to go through the firewall and go to our cylinder. So something else when planning this out, get everything laid out, because you want to make one pass through the firewall. It makes it a lot easier to get all of it pulled through at once rather than feeding individual wires. Now our vacuum barb fitting here is going to have a larger diameter hose that's going to tie into our brake booster, and that's going to have a nice clean supply of air to where it can pull through it. It's going to have a one-way check valve on that, so it's not going to be pulling pressure from the crankcase of the vehicle, but it's going to have that nice clean supplied air. Now you do have an exhaust port here. Just make sure that that's not covered. That's just going to vent out. And you'll see there's tabs here. You can just self-tap this in. If you need to get creative, you can bend these tabs to kind of custom mount it. So really, as far as mounting it here, I haven't fully decided exactly where I want, but I mean, you can do something pretty clever. You can mount it up here on your core support. You can, if you really want to, depending on some of your plastics, you can mount up on there. So I'll find a nice spot. It's nice and open in here, so it shouldn't be too hard, but the main thing is just making sure we have access to all these portions to make our connections a little bit easier. Now inside the vehicle, we'll have 2 components that we'll be tying in. First one is going to be how our brakes are actually applied. So this has our cylinder mounts up on our brake pedal, and you'll see this has a push connect fitting for that 1/4-inch airline that I mentioned earlier that feeds through the firewall. So when pressure is called for the brakes to be applied, the cylinder is going to slide back, pulling tension on our cable, and this little bracket is going to be anchored onto the firewall. So that's going to become that mounting point. So when we get this to pull, it's going to pull that brake pedal closer to the firewall, bringing the vehicle to a slower stop. Now it has a reed switch attached, which is really nice on the Air Force One because there's no need for a stoplight switch as some of the other braking systems require. So that's really nice that that's included, and it's just simply a sensor that picks up on the magnet inside. So when this is applied, it's going to light this up and know that the brakes are physically being applied, and that's going to tie into our indicator light. And this is a LED wired connection here, and this generally mounts up on the rear view mirror. It's going to light up with the 3 diodes anytime those brakes are being applied, because the reed switch is going to send that sensor. So you can mount this anywhere on the dash. The main thing is that way when you're looking back while towing and you see this lit up, you know that the brakes are physically being applied. So don't let this braking system intimidate you. It's not particularly hard to do. You are going to be routing wires kind of through firewalls, which gets a little bit tricky, but follow along the instructions. There's some really great diagrams that I use every time I install these, just as a reminder. So follow along with the video as well as the instruction manual for all your wiring and air diagrams. That way you know you have all your connections made, and just take your time and we'll get your braking system installed. So I'm gonna go ahead, get everything mounted up, and then I'll show you all those connections and how it works. So up front, where we had these brackets, I ended up mounting my breakaway switch here and then my air fitting right here. And I kind of mocked up the fascia, and it's open here, so we shouldn't have to trim in this configuration. I did end up flipping this to where it's a little bit higher, so that way it's nice and open. So you might want to do the same thing and just kind of test fit your fascia on here before getting everything permanently bolted up. Now, electrical on this system is very easy, so let's focus on that first. So off of our breakaway switch, there's going to be an orange and a black wire, and we need to route this towards the main unit and towards the battery, which are both going to be in the engine bay. So I simply just kind of use wire loom to kind of tie this in here, but this just routes up and behind the tail light. And I just kind of made my way over to where I mounted up our main unit. I just used some self-tapping screws to put on the core support. It's not going to make contact with the fan because the shroud's there, and this seems to be a really good spot for it. Now there's two electrical wires off of the main unit, and they're just two black wires, so it doesn't matter which one you grab, but one of these is going to attach to that black wire that's on the breakaway switch. And I used a heat shrink butt connector, and this is really important for anything in the engine bay or anything that lives on the exterior of the vehicle, because this is a really nice way to not only crimp it down, but once you heat this up, it's going to create a nice watertight seal and a really good hold. And to do that, it's pretty easy. Just like a normal butt connector, you would just, go ahead and cut your wires, and when you're making your connection, you strip back. Normally I'll go about that much, maybe a quarter of an inch or so. Give these a little twist so they slide in better. And then with the heat shrink butt connector, you're just simply going to crimp this down. And then you are going to need to use a heat gun to cinch this up. And what you're looking for is, as you put heat to it, it's going to start to shrink down, and you'll see it kind of adhere to the wire. It almost becomes translucent, and sometimes a little bit of goo is going to come out the edge. But the main thing is check your ends to make sure that there's no opening, and that way it's nice and watertight. So just kind of evenly pass the heat. And try to keep your wires as straight as possible. It gives it a little better chance of cinching up. So as I heat this up, as I mentioned, it almost becomes a little more translucent, or the color change on the wire. You can see it start to cinch up around it. And once you check your end, you should see that little bit of goo that popped through. That's a good sign. Just go around the entire thing again and check for any gaps. But this is how I made all of my connections. So pretty easy here. And this is just a cheap way to make sure that your connections stay taut and protected the entire time. Now, as far as putting any ring terminals, that's pretty easy as well. You're just going to strip off an end and then just crimp those down. Now, those aren't heat shrinks, so just once you get your ring terminal on there, just crimp it down. Always give it a quick tug to make sure that it's nice and secure. It's not going to become loose over time. So that's what I used on our first connection. So either black wire, doesn't matter, but attach that to the black wire off the breakaway switch. Now the other black wire, pretty easy. It comes out the same spot. This just goes to a ground. And what I did was I just ran this over, and there's a factory bolt here that I was able to use as a factory ground. So I just placed a ring terminal on there and grounded that down. So that takes care of the electrical off of the main unit, but we still have this orange wire off of our breakaway switch. And this is eventually going to make its way over to our fuse holder and eventually to 12-volt power, but it does need to tie in to this violet wire. The violet wire is actually from the inside of the vehicle. This runs to our reed switch and our indicator light, so it needs 12-volt power for that light to illuminate when the brakes are being applied. So this does eventually run into the firewall along with a 1/4-inch airline tube. And also, if you're using a fuse master like we have here that disconnects the ABS fuse so it stops draining your battery, you're also going to want to run the switch wire in at the same time. As we get inside the vehicle, I'll show you exactly where we routed that. So the orange attaches to that violet. It's more of a brown color, but that's what they indicate in the instructions. So when they say violet, they're talking about this wire here. I used a larger gauge heat shrink butt connector. That way I could get both of these tied together and have enough space in there. And then your fuse holder comes in a loop. You're just simply going to cut that, whatever works best as far as length, and attach a ring terminal. Now as far as your 12-volt power, there is this stud here. A 10 millimeter is going to pull this up, and that's going to allow you to get that ring terminal in place and get 12-volt power. Now throughout all of this, I highly recommend do not have your fuse in place until everything's fully connected, because you're going to allow electricity to go through that, so we don't want to do that until we have everything set up. Since I have everything put together, I went ahead and put my 10 amp fuse in our fuse holder. Now my violet wire, this is what I passed through the firewall, and the hole that you're going to want to use that I found that works really well is from the hood latch release. So if you find where your hood latch is, there's a cable that runs through a small grommet. I simply pulled that grommet out, put a hole through it, and then passed this along with my 1/4-inch airline tube. I also mentioned that fuse master I had to run the switch wire through, so I passed those through. So this attaches to the violet wire that's on our reed switch. And the reed switch here, as I mentioned earlier, it's got a magnet, and that way when this is applied on normal driving, it's not going to do anything, but when you pull the cylinder back, when it's actually braking, that's going to send a signal and get that 12-volt power, which will then pass over to our indicator light. So off the reed switch, pretty easy. Violet wire is going to go to the violet one that goes out to the battery. The blue wire, this is going to attach to the red wire off of our indicator light. The black wire off our indicator light is just simply a ground. So here I just attached a longer white wire. I found a factory bolt that I used as a ground, so just put a ring terminal on there so it's grounded. And then as far as running your indicator light, pretty easy. I popped this panel out and just ran it along the stripping all the way up and then into the headliner. You can just take a plastic trim tool and push that in and kind of get this placed in here. That weather stripping is going to hold it in. And then there's just double-sided tape, and you put this on your rear view mirror. You can put it on your dash as well, whatever works best. And this is going to light up anytime that the brakes are applied, and that way you know for sure the brakes are actually being applied. So as I pull this cylinder back, you're going to see that the lights will illuminate. So with the electrical kind of already taken care of, we looked at all that. Let's focus on the air lines. And the first thing at the front, we do have our air fitting, as I mentioned, and this is a push connect fitting. And the main thing with push connect fittings is having a nice clean cut here. That way when you press this in, you should feel a little resistance. Pushing it a little farther, you're going to feel it kind of almost click in, and give it a quick tug. It should stay in place. Now if you need to ever remove this, you just push down on the collar on the airline fitting, and that's going to release it. But this does a really good job of biting onto that airline. Now when it comes to cutting airline to length, which you are going to have to do, you may be tempted to use a pair of snips or crimps or something like that, but as I do that, you can see it gives it an almond shape, and it's not a very clean circle for it to go into our fitting, and that's really going to be a high potential for leaking. So I use a tubing cutter. It's essentially just a razor blade on a flat surface, and it allows you to really square it up and get a nice clean cut here. Make sure there's no burrs, but that's going to allow this to really seat in that push connect fitting, and just overall it's going to make sure that there's not leaks. You're going to want to cut them nice and clean on every connection that you make. So this airline, I just routed it along with the rest of my diode wiring as well as my breakaway switch up pretty much the same path as we took as the electrical. And on our main unit, there's going to be 3 air fittings that we're looking at. There's air in, there's air out, and those 2 are push connect, and then you have a barb fitting, which is going to be vacuum. So since we're getting air in from the coach, make sure that you route that to the air in. As again, push connect, so make sure that that goes in and seats properly. Now our air out is what's going to feed into our cylinder to apply the brakes. So this, I just simply routed over, and it makes its way eventually with our violet wire through that grommet that I mentioned earlier, and eventually goes to our air cylinder that's mounted up on our pedal. So the airline, as I mentioned, that grommet, it's right here. It is fairly small, so I did have to cut out some of that rubber to pass everything through. So you may have to do the same thing. And eventually, once I'm done getting everything tucked up and zip tied, I'm gonna go back with a little bit of black RTV silicone to seal that up, just to make sure that water doesn't get there long term and get into the inside of the vehicle. So the airline tube, I just rounded it over. The push connect fitting is here at the top of our cylinder. Now, as far as mounting the cylinder, I looked for a nice anchor point, and it seems like the bracket that we have from the factory, I was able to self-tap screws into that, and that's going to be a nice sturdy point for it. The main thing is you have your cable pretty much in a straight line with the cylinder, and you also kind of want to have it at a slight angle, and that way actuate the pedal and pull the cylinder, and it should become a straight line, but you kind of want it at a downward angle, because as it pulls that pedal, it kind of swoops in an arc. So play with the tension. You don't want the cable too tight, and it's all tightened down by a grub screw. You want just a little bit of slack, and the main thing, it's not pulling the pedal when you're just normally driving around, so make sure you have enough slack for that. And when you're happy with it, you can go ahead and tighten down that grub screw. Don't get too crazy with it. Basically, if it's flush with that anchor, you should be good. And then the last thing that we needed to tie up is going to be this vacuum. And this just slides over the barb fitting. Now, these can get a little bit tricky getting fittings to go in, so I recommend using a silicone lube. That'll help kind of slide that on there. And essentially, we're just teeing into the booster line from the factory. And the brake booster is against the firewall, but that line does run underneath here, kind of by where you check your oil. So just to make it a little bit easier, I ended up cutting that line. This is where that tubing cutter really comes in handy. And it comes with stepped fittings, barbs that reduce it down. So I used a larger section, put that in the factory hose, and then attached my new hose. I did use a hose clamp here to clamp that down, but then we just made our way to our T, and then you can see that this loops around here back to our main unit, but we need to make sure that we have check valves in place. So this one-way check valve, make sure that this isn't going to be pulling pressure from the crankcase, but also when you're using the vehicle, you're not going to have any pressure that's going into the main unit. So make sure that right off a quick run here, you're putting your one-way check valve in place, so you'll have the black portion facing towards the main unit, and the lighter green color is going to head towards the booster line. Now, we can follow this here, and this goes into our T, but our factory line here continues on, so I use the T, and that just goes down and attaches to the other portion of that line that I cut, but I also put a one-way check in there just because we don't want to pull from the crankcase. So make sure you have a one-way check valve in place by the crankcase. The black should face towards the motor, and the green should face back towards our T. So that covers the vehicle side. Unfortunately, you're not going to be able to test the braking system until you hook it up to the RV, because air needs to charge through the system for it to work. But I'm going to go ahead, get everything zip tied up and wire loom just to make it nice and clean. You can check your indicator light by just pulling that cylinder back, so make sure that's working. And then we're going to go to the RV, so I'll show you that side to get that all hooked up, and then we can see the braking system in action. Now, when it comes to getting the RV side done on the Air Force One, the first thing I always recommend is mounting up your air fitting. Try to get it on the same side that you put the air fitting on your vehicle. It just kind of keeps that coiled line in line and not crossing over. So to get this mounted up, I just drilled through the fiberglass here, put some washers on the back side and tighten that up. You then have a push connect fitting for our 1/4-inch air line, just as we had on the vehicle. And you're basically going to have the long spool. I always recommend starting to run it towards where all of your air connections are going to be, and that's a big part of it too. We have a 1999 Fleetwood Discovery, so yours may be a little bit different. This is a Freightliner chassis, but if you check the instructions, they're pretty good about laying out where you're going to be tying into, and the lines generally are highlighted pretty well in a bright green color. So I'll trace this line and show you where I started to route that, and then show you where I mounted up my tank and where we're going to be cutting into. So when running your airline, you do need to make sure you're not going to hit any exhaust or moving parts, anything like that that can damage the airline long term. And the best route generally is following along the frame rail. You're going to have a lot of other factory wire loom and zip ties as well as clamps that you can route it through to kind of support that airline. So I kind of made my way up, and right in front of the bags I have the rest of our airline, and we're going to be using all of this or close to it to make sure that we tie into our other fittings, so don't cut anything yet until we have it all laid out. And as far as mounting up your tank, you have lots of different options. You can put it in the side of a frame rail, whatever kind of works best for you, but on ours there's a shelf that's kind of on a beam there, and I was able to drill out the holes and get that mounted up, just kind of using the hardware that came with it. So now the next thing you need to do is figure out where your factory airlines are. So you're going to be looking for the air manifold. Your supplied air is generally going to be a larger diameter green hose, and I've gone ahead and put some painter's tape to denote where that's at. We'll be using our tubing cutter to cut that. Now keep in mind you are going to have air in the system, so don't be surprised when that air leaks out. And then you're also going to need to find your supplied air, and this again comes down to checking the instruction manual to figure out where yours is at, but this is going to tie into our tank as well. So I'll start with our supplied air, and that's going to be that larger diameter green hose. We're going to be cutting a small section. Try to get the flattest section you can. You may have to take off a small amount to account for our fitting. A lot of times those lines are not very flexible and there's not a whole lot of excess, so definitely take your time making sure you have a good clean cut. And once you cut it, I recommend taking a rag and some brake cleaner and cleaning the outside of that hose. That's going to give it a little bit cleaner of a bite onto our push connect fitting to make sure that it's not going to leak. And all this is going to do is tee into that. Eventually our 1/4-inch airline tube is going to tie into the bottom and go to the supplied section of the tank. We're also going to be putting in this smaller T on our metered air. So I'm going to go ahead, I'll get these in place and then show you how it looks. So now that I have those T's in place, I'm going to go ahead with the airline that we've ran to the back fitting, and I'm going to put this on one side of the tank. There's 2 fittings. This is going to go on the furthest one out. It's going to be a 90 push connect fitting. So I'm going to just route this up, make sure I have enough length, cut it, and get that in place. So with that attached, now I have the rest of my airline to make our connections to the other push connect fittings off the tank. Now where we put our line that runs to the back there, that's on the same side as that push connect, that's going to go to our metered air. So that's going to be the smaller diameter T that we used. And on the other side, you have a regulator there. That's going to run to our supplied air. So go ahead, take your airlines and plug those into the T's that we just put on the larger lines. So off of the side that has the regulator on our tank, I just routed that up to, again, our T that's the larger diameter. So I have both of those hooked up. We got our line running to the back. We do need to make sure that it's not leaking, and the way to do that is start the RV, let the air build up to its normal operating pressure, and then shut it off, and then we'll spray some soapy water. Audibly, you're going to want to be listening for them, but that soapy water is going to pick up on any small leak, and if we do have any leaks, we can go back, reset any of our lines, and hopefully that should fix it. Now with the air charged in the system, we can go ahead and spray down all the fittings with a soapy water solution, and what you're looking for is large bubbles to start forming. So anywhere where we've made a connection, you're going to want to spray that down and just kind of give it a minute, see if those bubbles start forming. Now, if you do have bubbles starting to form, what you need to do is let the air out of the system, and then we're going to reseat any of the fittings by just undoing them from the collars on the push connects and then resetting them. You might want to clean them and make sure that the cut is nice and squared up. A lot of times that can cause those leaks. But if everything's working properly, you're then going to want to hook up to your vehicle with your jumper cable and test the brakes to make sure they're working. So go ahead, you can take the caps that are on your air fittings off. I recommend keeping these, and that way when you're not hooked up to your vehicle, you can put those in place. It's going to keep any dust, dirt, and debris from building up inside the fitting. And these just push back. That collar should snap in place. We'll get this side hooked up, and then we'll hop in the RV, hit the brakes, and you're going to want to have someone check that the pedal's actuating properly and also that your indicator light's going on while it's actuating that pedal. So now that we know that our brakes are working while hooked up to the RV, all that's left to do is get the rest of our flat tow components set up, hooked up to the vehicle, get your vehicle in flat tow mode, and then you're ready to hit the road. And that was a look and installation of the Demco Air Force One supplemental braking system on a 2016 GMC Terrain.